I'm really excited about Maura being here with her talk and getting to share some of engineering education with all of us. So a little bit about who she is. She is an associate professor of mechanical engineering and curriculum instruction at UT Austin. She is also an associate editor for JEE and on the board of ASEE. Previously, she was a program director at NSF. She was the associate dean and director of interdisciplinary graduate programs, and that was at Virginia Tech. And she has received several research awards for her work in engineering education. She has received a U.S. Presidential Early Career Award for scientists and engineers. She's had an NSF career grant. She's had 2 American Educational Research Associates, so the AERA awards for her journal publications. She has kind of a nice variety of engineering education research that she could talk about and share, later in some of the meetings that we have later today. She has worked with the transfer of Hispanic students from 2- to 4-year institutions. She's looked at how instructors make decisions about their teaching. She's looked at learning in graduate research groups, so different size groups, how learning happens, and interdisciplinary education and teamwork. So the talk today, she's going to talk to us about her work with students' resistance to active learning, which I think is of particular interest to some of us who are really looking at introducing more active learning into our classes. So thanks for coming to talk and share with us today. And Maura would like to know a little bit about you. So we're going to go around and introduce ourselves so she kind of knows who she's talking to. So we'll start with you, Donna.
So I'm Donna Reese, Department Head of Computer Science and Engineering here. I've been here 26 years. And I hadn't noticed the orange on your slides, but I'm a Texas A&M grad.
But you're here anyway.
But I'm here anyway.
I'm Bindu Nanduri, an assistant professor in the Department of Basic Sciences, College of Veterinary Medicine.
Brian Jones in Electrical and Computer Engineering, and I look at writing to learn programs. So I'm teaming up with Donna and Gina.
John Usher, Department Head of Industrial Systems Engineering.
I'm James Winnock. I'm the Associate Dean in the College of Engineering.
Priscilla Hill, I'm Associate Professor in Chemical Engineering, and I'm kind of experimenting with active learning and doing a little bit of screencast and stuff along with my lectures.
Cool. Hey, I'm Amy Barton. I'm an instructor of technical writing.
I'm Kelly Aichi. I'm also an instructor of technical writing.
I'm Leslie Schroderman. I'm an associate professor in industrial and systems engineering.
Stan Bullington, I'm a professor of industrial systems engineering.
I'm Danielle Grimes. I'm a graduate research assistant in biomedical engineering with my research in engineering education.
LaShawn Simpson, assistant professor in bioengineering.
Rachel McFalls, graduate research assistant in aerospace engineering with research in engineering education.
Me again, Mom. I'm Solomon, aerospace engineering.
Hi, Seamus Franey, civil and environmental engineering, and I went to Oklahoma.
I'm Janice Cunningham, a master's student in biomedical engineering with a master's pursuit.
And I'm Jean Mohammadi Iraq, assistant professor of engineering education here in the college and in electrical and computer engineering.
I'm John Bercano with the technical communication program here in the college. We do the technical writing and presenting component of the curriculum, and we use a lot of active learning.
Great, sounds like a great group. I'm so excited about the enthusiasm and the things that I've heard so far at dinner and just riding back from the airport about all the different exciting things you're doing in engineering education here. And so it's great to see everybody. Thanks for coming. So I'm going to talk about this project on student resistance to active learning. What I love about this topic is that it's like immediately recognizable to people what you're talking about, right? So you can be in an elevator. I do plenty of research where you can't explain for a whole elevator ride in a long tower what the heck you're doing or why anybody would care. But I love this one because you can just say that, and that's part of the reason why we're calling it student resistance. It's probably more appropriately student reaction because you don't always want them to resist. But that sort of catches people right away. I have a story about that, right? This has happened to me, right? So I want to learn more about it. We have a huge research team. It's not necessarily a huge grant, but for a lot of these engineering education projects, they like to see different populations of students at different institutions, and so that's one of the reasons why we're doing this is so that we can collect data at lots of different places. But my collaborators and I also have lots of different backgrounds. So one of them is a physics education researcher, and some of them do a lot more faculty development, and I'm a little bit more on the research side. And two of the people on here are graduate students from 2 different institutions that we're working together on this. Okay, so let's get going. Okay, why do we care about student resistance? There's a lot of good evidence about lots of different types of active learning, so I'm just going to use the term active learning to refer to lots of different types of things that you can do to actively engage students in class, instead of I'm just talking and they're going to take down notes, but something like let's work on this problem, let's answer this question, sort of collectively all of that. So lots of good evidence, but there's a big gap. We don't have great data about this, but we all strongly suspect that people are not doing nearly as much of that as the research evidence would suspect. We're sort of falling back on lecture. So why is that? Okay. There's a couple different reasons. If you interview instructors, which lots of different studies have done, and you ask them, okay, why aren't you doing more of this? There's just a handful of reasons that keep floating to the top of the list, okay? So I don't have a lot of time in class because there's a lot of content I need to cover. I don't have a lot of time out of class because it takes more time to prepare something that's different from what I've been doing than using my same lecture notes. But the other one is that the students won't like it. They'll get me on my teaching evaluations at the end of the semester. Or maybe even in class, it'll be weird and confrontational because they'll complain out loud about what I'm asking them to do. Okay, so of these, people have done a lot of work here to try to explain to instructors how, yeah, there's a big hump that you need to get over, but once you've developed it, there's lots of different ways that it'll save you time down the road. Hardly anybody's actually looked at student resistance. So you can find some stuff in the literature about, I've been teaching for 40 years, and here's what I think is going on, or here's some strategies that I do. But in terms of like empirical studies where people have collected data and analyzed it and talked about what strategies work, there's a huge gap, a huge opportunity for our team to look at this. Okay, so one more motivation slide here. This pipeline diagram is a little bit hard to read for me, but if you're thinking about, we've got engineering instructors sort of coming in on this end, and reasons why they might not do active learning. So you've got this first set of people who don't even know about the strategies, but that's a really small number, that's 3%. People who have not tried them, that's 11%. So basically, the largest number on this whole chart of where we lose people, sort of on the way to widespread active learning, is people who've tried it, but stopped doing it. Okay? So there's something about the first time that you do it, it doesn't go that well, or it doesn't go well enough to sort of sustain you to try to keep improving it. Okay? And we think that, again, because you talk to instructors and they say student resistance, that would be one of the largest reasons that we want to start addressing and thinking about. Okay, so just to formalize this and give you an idea of where we're going, we've got some research questions that are guiding this whole entire project. So what factors influence student resistance to non-traditional teaching methods? And we're focusing on those introductory engineering courses, the ones that are typically the largest lecture type of courses, maybe required, maybe instructors are not as happy about teaching them because they're not as fun, you're not with the students who have decided to be in your major necessarily. Okay. What theories help explain this? Okay, so again, if there's not a lot of research out there, it's hard to know exactly what theory would help you explain it. And then, in the end, what can instructors do? So what are the things that you can control that would make it better, things that we can tell people to do when they try to do this in their teaching? Okay, so I have a lot of really messy theory slides. So before we do that, let's take a minute to just sit back. I'm going to have you do some active learning and talk to your neighbors, okay? This also stops people from falling asleep during your talk, it turns out. Okay, so just think about it for a minute. We'll do a think, pair, share. So about 1 minute, think to yourself about this answer, and then you can talk to your partner about it and share your answers, and then I want to hear some good ones from you. Okay, what types of things do you think would influence that? So again, we're talking about stuff that you could control, probably. So there's some characteristics about the students coming in, but what as an instructor might be some variables that would help you think about that. So I'm not looking for specific strategies, but maybe categories. So one of them might be instructor strategies, things that you do when you talk to the students about the activity. Does that make enough sense to start working on it? Okay, so I'll have 1 silent minute, and I'll let you know when you're allowed to talk. So turn to someone sitting close to you. If you have to get up and move to be close to someone, please do that. And talk about something that you came up with. Making you earn your pay here, huh? Moving around.
Maybe normally it's because we give such instruction.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah. That's different. Because there's so one thing I've done
before you send that,
yeah, so one of the things that, and again, just because the types of things you have to they know the answer is out. Talking to anybody else, so why should they talk to anybody else? And if it's too hard, then they feel frustrated to get anything out. So then they get one way or the other.
Hey, heard some really, really good stuff. So I hope y'all are not afraid to volunteer some of those that the rest of the group can hear. Yeah. Some kind of weird physical thing that makes people stop. Yeah. I tend to just chit chat about it until everybody calms down. Okay. All right. Who's ready to volunteer?
I think expectations of the student who come to a class expecting the instructor to teach. They don't want to do things in the class. I'm here, you should teach me.
Yes, and I heard that from lots of people around the table and lots of nodding. Yeah. So what the students expect to get from the class, and there's lots of outside experiences that lead them to expect that, I'm just going to go to class, the instructor is going to talk, they're not going to, really even be able to see me if I'm reading the newspaper or checking Facebook or those kinds of things. And when you kind of break that contract, like you entertain me as a student, I'm paying a lot of tuition money. I don't know if you'll hear that, but that kind of thing. Yeah, okay, what else? That was a great one.
I would say the way the instructor communicates, like their expectations of the student for the active learning, I feel like a lot of students don't really know what's required. So what do you want me to do again? So they're maybe not communicating the instructions clearly or what's expected of the students. Students are confused.
Good, yeah. So communicating clearly, like what are you even supposed to be doing when I let you go talk to your classmates? Okay, very good.
And one of ours kind of went along with that. Students not really understanding or believing that it's relevant, that it's going to help them learn. So maybe we need to do a better job of really explaining how it connects to course material.
Why are we doing that, right? Because working with the material is going to help you learn, or we've heard lots of people say, this is what it's going to be like when you're out there as an engineer. You're going to have to work in teams and you're going to have to work in groups. Yeah, and repeating that to students over and over again. Okay.
So that goes right along with that's what we were talking about, exact same thing, the expectations. But it's not just so much the faculty not relating the expectations, it's that they're so accustomed to us giving very, very clear directions at a beginning and an ending. I'm just going over homework that I've got to post, and I better have everything in there so they will know exactly what to do. And this is kind of a little bit open-ended, so they feel unsafe.
Yeah.
So they're having to navigate a little bit.
Harder to know if you're doing it right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Sort of to add on to that, one of the things that we talked about was
You know, if you give them a project and, you know, set them free for a few weeks, maybe have some smaller assignments leading up to the big assignment to check in and make sure that they're on track. Yeah, to structure things. Good. You had a good variation on this.
Ours?
Yeah.
So we were talking about how instructors respond to active learning exercises, whether they give positive feedback or they degrade the students, or how you're responding to group discussions and things.
How you deal with it. Definitely. There's ways to ask students to sort of take a risk, do something that's a little open-ended and be like, well, you did it wrong, right? Or even just sort of move on after it. Like have some students report back and you don't really link that up with the rest of what we're doing in the class. So that was really great. I think we heard from almost all the groups. You did a fantastic job of anticipating things. It's a little bit scary. I just added this slide. It's the first time I've done this activity. So you did a really fantastic job of anticipating what's going to be on the next couple slides. So
you did a good job modeling positive feedback. Right?
I tried. And we're learning a lot about. It'll sort of come out in the talk. Just little things that instructors do, like walking around the room, walking all the way to the back. And when students doesn't look like they're working on the activity, you confront them, but in a non-confrontational way. You can say, yeah, these guys finished. And I said something like, oh, are you done already? I don't know what I said. But yeah, or do you know what you understand what we're supposed to be doing right now, or or something like that, or are you stuck? Or those kinds of things. So students are actually just as non-confrontational as we are. So most of the time that'll make them wake up and at least look like they're doing the activity. Okay, so we've established there's not one big theory that's going to explain student resistance, but if you stop and think about it for a few minutes, you can come up with some really good ideas for things. And that's what we did. So we ended up chunking together a bunch of different theories. And I don't expect you to remember all of these, but they'll keep coming out during the talk. So the first one is expectation violation, and that was the first answer that you gave me. So this is a study that they've done in physics education, where students are expecting a certain kind of class, and the way that they've studied this is by surveying them a few times in the semester. So at the very beginning, what did you think this class would be like? Did you think you would spend a lot of time taking notes? Did you think you would talk to students? Did you think you would talk to the instructor? Not so much. And then 2 weeks into the semester, after they've, the class has started its rhythm and you've had that first day where you explain what the class is about, have students change their answers to those questions and then ask them again at the end of the semester. How often did you actually do these things? And their sort of theory is that if you can match up that second week of the semester more closely with what happens during the semester, that students' responses like, this class was helpful to me, I liked the class overall, are going to be better. So that's one study and one sort of idea that we're drawing from. There's another one, this student resistance one, where they just categorize the different ways that students can resist or react. So there's this open resistance, which we're actually not seeing hardly at all, where students actually complain. If I say work in your groups and somebody says really like, this is really stupid, I'm not doing it. Like, that doesn't happen, but I think that's what we're really afraid of happening when we don't want to lose control in the classroom. But there's other ways. Partial compliance, there's a couple different ways that you can do that. You would like do the activity really fast or copy off of your friends. There's a couple different ways where you're like sort of doing it, but not really doing it the way that we meant to do it. And then passive, where you don't do it, but you sit there quietly. Or we've seen students get up and like go to the bathroom and check their phones until the instructor says, okay, everybody calm down, I'm going to give you the answer. So different really subtle ways to sort of avoid doing the activity. Or if you're supposed to talk in groups, you can always just talk about something else, which I've totally done. I start to notice that I do that as a professional too, plenty of the time. Okay, and then there'd also be probably some kind of emotional aspect of this, or a value construct. Like the student has to. We talked about this, communicating to the student why you're doing this and how it fits in. So if the student doesn't believe you, they think this is a waste of my time because this is not real engineering and this is not going to help me learn. That's going to be really different from if you explain it to students and they believe you and understand you, that this is a good use of my time, that would probably have something to do with it. And then finally, we needed a framework for just characterizing what are the activities that you're asking the students to do, right? You need to know that, at least as a control, to sort of understand the situation, that there's a big difference between classes where they're doing projects and classes where I'm mostly lecturing, but sometimes I ask students to talk to each other or answer a clicker question. That there would probably be some things about what you're asking students to do, how long it takes, that would sort of influence that. And this gives us a framework for, you know, what's more active and less active and interactive because you're constructing knowledge and things like that. So we'll come back to that. Okay. All right. So the design for our study is in 3 phases. So we had to come up with all the theories and come up with all the instruments for how we wanted to study this. Okay. So we're through phase 1, and this semester we're in phase 2. So the first one was to sort of come up with all the instruments, and I have another slide where I'll show you what all the instruments are. And then some triangulation to check things. So we moved from observing classes where even though you can structure the observation, you can still write down things that you see that you didn't know that you were looking for. But then moving that towards something that could be more quantitative, a survey of students, but you want to have all the questions for all the possibilities and all the things that you want to know about on that survey. So this semester we're doing surveys and observations in the same class to make sure that we're seeing the same thing. There's not extra stuff happening in the class that's not being captured in the survey. And then we're going to scale up to survey at a lot more places where we can't be doing observations because you just don't have the manpower or the travel money or all of those things. But then that'll give us a nicer idea of what's going on across a wider range of institutions and student populations and introductory engineering courses and majors and all of those kinds of things that we want to sample across. Okay, so this is the one that kind of lays out the instruments. Okay. We used focus groups a couple different times with students, so it was pretty easy at the beginning to say, you know, this has a really important student component about what they think is going on, right? And the more I do this project, the less it's about like, you know, what's the truth about what happens in the classroom versus what does the instructor think is happening and what do the students think is happening, right? And how do you interpret that when people act a certain way? Does it mean like they don't want to learn, or does it mean that they just don't understand the activity, or they're uncomfortable, or you know, those kinds of things. So we thought it was important to know what students thought. So we talked to them just sort of, you know, open-ended, like what expectations did you have for college? You know, and they say, well, you watch TV, and you either party all the time in college, or you go to a boring science lecture. And that's what they think college is because that's what's on television. Okay? And then we move that towards sitting in real classrooms and watching for these things. What kinds of things are the students asking, what are the instructors asking the students to do? How do they talk about the activity? And then looking around the room and seeing which students are doing the activity, and if they're not doing it, what are they doing? Those kinds of things. And then, as I mentioned, sort of moving that into some survey instruments. So in the classrooms where we're basically blind because we're not observing, you can collect more data. And again, sort of, this is a literal triangle. You don't need 3 things to triangulate, but in order to sort of, you know, try to get at a better, fuller picture of what's going on, you'd want to collect data from a couple different directions. So we're talking to instructors about what they plan to do in the class, asking them very similar questions, and then at the end of the semester, taking all of the student data to the instructor, showing it to them. Hopefully they also have their end of course things because that's another important part of the feedback, and talking about that with the instructor. What does this mean to you? Does this mean it worked or it didn't work? Are you going to keep doing it? How do you think through that process? How do you interpret that data? Okay, so as I said before, you know, the students watch TV and movies. You're going to party in college and do boring lectures. But we also found out that students don't necessarily remember things. So this funny thing happened. We went to visit one of the collaborators to do focus groups, and she ended up just getting the students from her own class to participate. And we interviewed them and said, we're not going to talk to your instructor, you know, about what happened. What you say in this room is confidential. And they said, you know, it's cool. I wasn't sure about it at first, but she said over and over again that this is how real engineers work, and you know, and this, so I'm kind of on board with it. I wasn't sure about it. My friend dropped the class because he couldn't deal with it, you know, those kinds of things. And I just mentioned something like that to her as we were leaving, and she's like, oh my God, they complained so much at the beginning of the semester, and they kind of don't remember it. Like we asked them that, you know, kind of directly. I was like, well, did you ever talk to the instructor about it? Did you ever say anything? And they're like, nah. I don't know, it's, you know, so that was like sort of my first hint that like we need to talk to everybody to sort of get the whole thing. You know, but it gave us some ideas for what to look for when we did our observations. Okay, and then we spent a lot of time just developing an observation protocol, and so it's actually very structured in terms of what kinds of things you look for. And then I think this was a kind of a unique process that we did. So even though we tried really hard with the observation protocol to get things that were more objective, so instead of saying like, I think the students are bored, it would be like, write down what the students are doing that makes you think that they're not participating? Like, what are they doing? So things that are more objective, like this many students are looking at computer screens, and this many students are sleeping, and and those kinds of things that would be a little bit better evidence if you're trying to make an argument, eventually when you write this up and present this work to people. So you're still making inferences based on the body language of the student about what's going on, if they're engaged or not engaged. So the way that we checked this was to do focus groups with students. And in some of the classrooms we did do video, but you have to be really careful, so everyone on the video needs to give informed consent. And we didn't, it's really difficult in a large lecture class, so we didn't do that. We couldn't actually use the real videos and be like, here's a video of you with your head down, are you participating in class or not? We found just these open access images online of students in class situations, and in the focus group with the students in a room like this, but probably not as nice, said, okay, look at these students. So which ones, pretend the professor just asked them to work on a problem. Which of these students do you think are actually working on the problem? And why? Or why not? And this was the most interesting one because there's a lot of different students up there, and then this was also the one where they came up with a lot of stories. They're like, I think this guy likes that girl, and but we got to do this like, well, they're leaning forward, so they're engaged in some kind of conversation, and they talked about the students in the back look like they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. The ones in front maybe are screwing around a little bit more, but we got to sort of verify our interpretation of people's body language when they're slouched down, when they're in their hats on, and heard maybe more than I want to hear about strategies that students use to, avoid things. But also some stuff like, if you're gonna go to so much trouble to make it look like you're doing work, you should just do the work. Yeah, they said class goes much faster when you do the problem that you're assigned to do instead of just like sit there and try to wait it out. So that helped to verify a lot of the things that we were getting from the observation protocol. So there's actually like two forms to the protocol. On the first day of class, we collect some basic information about the course. That's also when the instructor is most likely to, they might say, in this class we're going to do some problems or those kinds of things, but it's also when they say whether or not it's graded. Or, what are I'm going to take attendance and that's going to count towards your grade, or you're going to have to hand in, your responses to the clicker questions. You're graded whether you respond or whether it's right or wrong, or sort of those kinds of things, right? Because some people would assign a grade to those in-class activities and others would not. There's sort of different ways that you can do it, and one of the grad students right now is writing up a paper about how there's really there's not a right or wrong answer, because there's really different ways to motivate students to do that, and both ways can work if you do that. But to collect that basic information that's just sort of one time of characteristics of the whole class, and then the observation protocol, we said every instance of active learning. So every time the instructor says, okay, work on this, then there's all these characteristics of, are you working alone or in groups, or what's the nature of the problem, and those kinds of things. So to go quickly through this, we have an article in the International Journal of Engineering Education that's already out in print, and it's got the protocol in the back of it and some of the stuff that we learned. And I'm happy to send that to you or have Jean send it to you if you have questions about it. Okay, but so here's an example of the kinds of things that you would take. Are you doing discussion, and is it a group or individuals? Are you doing problem solving, again, group of individuals, or different types of things. So there's check boxes, and then there's also plenty of space to say, well, not exactly, this is actually how we did it. We had to talk about how do you think about faculty participation, and we had to define this, right? Because if it just says high, medium, and low, depending on who does the observation, they're going to interpret that differently. So we had to define high participation means you're going around the room, you're initiating conversation with students. Certainly if they flag you down, you talk to them, and medium is like only when students call you over, or only when students say, I have a question, or wait, what are we supposed to be doing? Then you answer those. And then we've also seen people do low, really low, where you give the student something to do and then you check your phone because there's a proposal deadline or or something like that. Okay, I'll admit to doing that too occasionally, but it makes a big difference. We're seeing. Okay, and then again, how are students engaged? And here it's defining like they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're talking to each other, and again, high, mixed, and low sort of gives you a range of looking around the room what percentage of students that are there that day are doing what they're supposed to be doing. A lot of web surfing. Yeah. Okay, so then we sort of did this in 4 classrooms, and there's some variation here that we'll digest down into some suggestions. So 2 different institutions, the ones where we had the grad students to be able to do the observations in the classes, a couple different engineering disciplines, mostly sophomore, but one of them was a first-year program. Most of the classrooms were like an auditorium, so there'd be rows or an aisle that the instructor, you could get to the back of the room, but you couldn't get to every student. And then there was one that was a cluster where every single student, you could stand behind them and look over their shoulder and see what they're doing and get around the room, which was really different. I think of these as pretty large enrollment classes, although there's larger that people could have. Okay, and then they asked the students to do different kinds of things, so different variations on working together, working apart, different ways that the instructors, we had the one guy that checked his phone, I think that was a guy, and then some that went around and confronted students, and different ways that students participate or chose not to participate in the activities. Okay, so you boil this down. These are, from that set of data, from that collection, these are the factors that tend to influence this. So how much the professor is going around and talking to students and confronting them. And we actually saw that you don't have to do it that many times, that there's a pretty lasting effect. If in one class period you go around to a student and you say, hey, are you done already? Well, if you're confused, why don't you ask your partner? Whatever, you have that conversation with them, why aren't you doing the activity? That actually for several class periods after that, that student will sit up and do what they're supposed to do because they, I guess, don't want that to happen again. Okay, and then what type of active learning? So we saw, definitely saw a difference in, things were difficult enough where you had to ask your neighbor, right? You were much more likely to do things like get up and move. So in that cluster classroom, there were students that would, every time they'd come in and sit by themselves. They'd sit at a cluster where there's nobody else. So a couple times the instructor, why don't you get up and move over? And then as the semester went on and the problems got more complicated and you really couldn't sit there and do it yourself, those students started getting up after the problem was assigned, after they had some time to think about the problem, they'd get up and move so they could sit with other students and talk to them. What seems to work the best is if you give students time to think about it individually first and then go into groups. I think it is just too tempting to go right into groups and not do what you're supposed to do. There's so many other things you can talk about in your groups. It also looks like you're basically doing what you're supposed to be doing depending on how much writing out. The classroom definitely helps. So again, if you have a classroom where you have access to the students and you can get around the room, that's much better. One of the instructors that was in the auditorium room really wanted to be in the cluster room and he kept talking about that with the students. It made him very uncomfortable, you could tell, so he just kept saying it in class. And then the size. I think for everybody there's some kind of threshold where you're more comfortable letting the students doing something unstructured and you feel like, okay, I can bring them back when it's time and those kinds of things. And just the bigger that gets, the more complicated, the more chaos, the less comfort level. Okay, so this is a mix of strategies that some of it comes out of the literature, and I want to talk about the ones at the bottom here that again are sort of coming out of the things that we're seeing in our observations. So explaining why we're doing this over and over again, as many times as possible in the semester. So if you just say it at the beginning on the first day of class, they're probably not going to hear you. We're going to do some group activities because there's research that says that this is how you learn better. You've got it every time. Okay, get in your groups because remember, this is how you learn engineering. Or get in your groups because this is what it's going to be like when you're engineers. You're going to have to learn to do this. This is an important learning outcome. This is part of the class. This isn't just an aside from the real engineering work. Probably some ramping up. So getting more complicated, but doing something pretty simple the first day. The students don't feel like, well, I haven't taken this class yet, or I haven't read anything yet, or whatever. But you can still engage with the material and talk about how you might apply it. But get bigger and bigger, get more complicated. Those things that are going to pull groups of students in because they're complicated problems that they can't do. And mix up the variety. That's something else that we saw over the semester. If you do the exact same structure, work on it for a minute, then talk to each other, and then report back to me, that gets kind of boring for students. So if you say, okay, well, this time we're going to do it this way, and this time we're going to do it this way, you don't have to go overboard and every single one is different, but every couple times, think of a slightly different way of doing things, a different structure. That's another thing that sort of keeps students interested and keeps them engaged in the activity. And then, so in one of the courses, they had clickers, but they also used, maybe it was Top Hat.
Oh, Top Hat is awesome.
Yeah, right. So they're writing. It was more of a programming course.
Yeah.
They had their laptops, which that's another like distraction, right? That they could be on whatever window, and not the one that you want them to be on. So if it's multiple choice, it's really, really easy to even do things like give your friend your clicker, so you don't even go to class that day, and they just click in for you, so you get the points. Or you just ask your friend, what did you get? C. Okay, you know, and I'm going to do that. But if you have to write a program and submit the program, then you really have to do your own work. And that's where it's commonsensical, but we also observed that, you know, more students were doing their own work when they've gotten that situation. Okay. I always talk longer than I expect to. Okay. And now we're working on the survey. And again, I said we're comparing what the instructor thinks is going on to what the student's thinking. And I already explained to you that that expectations is about surveying students a couple different times every semester to see if their expectations change about what they're going to do. Okay. So let's jump ahead. Here's what some of the survey items look like. And then we've also done the factor analysis. And I'm pretty surprised and impressed with how well that turned out. So, so in general, when you're thinking about making a survey, hopefully there's just one out there that someone has done all this work for you, and then you could use it in your engineering education research. But typically, you're thinking of a phenomenon like student resistance, and there's different components, and those components kind of chunk together into factors. So you'd have multiple questions to ask about that kind of thing, and then you can do statistics to tell you, okay, these questions, they hang together. It's not as simple as like students who, students all answer 5. If they answer 5 to this question, they're likely to answer 5 to this question. It could go in some more complicated up and down kind of ways, but this group of questions tend to be answered in the same way by this set of students in this part. And also the statistics can tell you that these are they're separate things. They shouldn't necessarily be combined into the same idea, and that's a way that you develop theory. And then develop surveys that are based on that theory is to have those chunks of questions, and again, the statistics tell you. So what you need to know about this is the alphas for each factor. It's good if it's above 0.7, and it's not good, and you should probably change something if it's below that. Okay, so so for a lot of these, we had at least 3 items, which is also good practice. I would be very surprised if these ones that we just had 2 items for came up any higher than this. So these aren't great. So we're going to treat this. This is, again, the resistance, how students react to it. They partially comply, they actively participate, or those kinds of things. We're going to treat that whole thing as a factor instead of as the individual factors. Okay. But we did a really good job with emotional and value, and we're starting to see some really nice relationships. So very clearly, if students think that the activities were worth their time, then they also answered really highly on actively participate, and vice versa. So if they said they answered very low, I don't think this activity was worth my time, then they were more likely to say, I sat around and did nothing during the activity, or I tried to get my friends to not do it with me, or those kinds of things. Do you want me to read some of these items? You probably can't read them because the slide is pretty bad. Or have you all had a chance to read them now that I've been talking for 10 minutes on this one slide? Yes, read them. You're good? Okay. Okay. All right. And then we argued for way longer than I want to admit about what's the difference between often and very often, and never and almost never. Hours on that, unfortunately. Okay. And then instructor strategies, we just pulled some from the literature, although I think we cleaned those up quite a bit with the observations, and we wrote some of these for that. And then they're starting to actually break out. So this was, there's 2 kinds of factor. You do confirmatory factor analysis when you have a pretty good idea of where the questions go because you wrote them to fit into different factors and you just want to confirm that that's the case. But this one, we did exploratory. So to say, you tell the program, basically the statistics program, say, tell me how these break out, if they break out, into subcategories. And we're actually seeing sort of 2 different categories about what the instructor can do. And we're still thinking about names for these, but one of them is more about the instructor doing things, so really clearly explaining to students things about the activity. Talking about why we're doing this, because it relates to learning. and planning good activities that students could do, and it would challenge them. Okay, so more about what the instructor does. And then there's ones that are more about the student. I mean, still the instructor doing it, but it's a little bit more about the student. So the instructor asks the students for feedback on the activity. How did that go? Did that help you? Those kinds of things. Walking around the room, making sure students were helped. Encourage students to engage with the activity. So that's kind of what you were saying about, you know, how do you react when students give you answers? Or just, there's lots of body language things that you can do where it's like, this is important, we're gonna spend class time on it, or like, just occupy yourself for 5 minutes, it doesn't really matter, right? That the instructor's doing things like that to support it, and giving students enough time without saying, okay, work on this, and then you have 2 minutes and you finally figured out what the problem is, and you're like, okay, give me your answers. Right, so that kind of stuff. So this is a little bit more focused on the students, maybe. I don't know. We've got to think for names for this. But I thought that was interesting that this came out. So this is really excellent, 0.8, and this is probably close enough to 7 that we'll keep it, I think. Okay. Expectancy violation. As I said, you repeat those questions a couple times during the semester, but then there's also, at the end of the semester, you ask them, how many times did you do this in the class? How many times did you really do it in the class? And then an ideal course. And this one we're still kind of dealing with, but you can see it's like, do I want to do more of this or less of this? So I piloted it with some freshmen, and they said, what do you mean? You know, and I was like, we want to know what you mean about an ideal course. And they're like, an ideal course is the one where I get an A. I don't know, you know, I don't know how to answer this. And I'm like, well, you know, did you like those activities? And I would like them if they help me do well in the class. It's like, okay, well, try your best. Try to answer the questions and let me know which questions were confusing to you. Besides that one, but it just to read some of these activities, brainstorm, listen to the instructor lecture. So that's kind of the control situation. Be graded on my class participation. Study with classmates outside of class. So most of the stuff is in class, actively engaging, but we're rounding all these things out with what's, you know. So if you didn't do these things, what would take up the rest of your time? Probably listening to the lecture. Okay. And this is, so again, I'm not sure what this means. So these are reliability numbers for this set of questions. And I sort of glossed over this really quickly, that there's, you know, passive activities like listening to lecture, taking notes, listening to instructions from the instructor, kind of things, versus active and interactive in construction. So active might be by yourself, you're trying to solve a problem. Interactive would be working with another student, and constructive is a little bit more creating something. Okay, so different items break out. You can, again, run the alphas on the factors. So the questions about what really happened in the class, these are not fantastic. This is good. So again, I said we're gonna treat them all together instead of all these different ones. But all these numbers are actually better when you go to the ideal course. So students, I think that says that students have a pretty good idea of what they want out of a course. It doesn't mean that they all want the same thing, but that they answer the different groups of questions consistently. So like the students who want it to be passive are going to answer all the passive questions really high, and then maybe some of these that are lower, and then there's another set of students who want to do more active stuff, so they'd answer these high and this low. But that's consistent over the whole group of students that's doing it. So all of these things sort of increase our faith in the survey, that we'll be able to find out things. And what we're working on right now is sort of the relationships between that. So that one that I told you about, the value, is probably the strongest one that's coming out right now. That again, the students who think it's worthwhile are going to actively participate, and the students who don't think it's worthwhile are going to find ways to resist. Okay, so I think I said before, we're in triangulation right now. So I actually should put my advertisement out. We are looking for study sites for next year, for fall or spring courses, where you're teaching a first year or second year engineering course, and you're asking students to actively engage in class. So we would send you the surveys, you give them to your students, but you would also get your own data, and we could spend some time talking about it with you. And so basically it would turn into a consultation, because we would also at the end share all the things that we're learning about how to do that. Okay, I think that's it. We have some publications, because I know you have time to read stuff. No, but if you want to see some more detail, it's out there. I sent these slides to Jean, and I'm happy to have her share them with you, or if you have trouble finding specific papers or anything like that. That's great. Okay, thanks.